Myth number 3. We're going to take a look at myth number 3, and that is that the text of the KJV has never changed. That all throughout its printing history, it remained the same from 1611 right to the 1769 Blaney edition. That's apparently a myth.
Yeah.
Why is that a myth?
I think probably most readers of the King James Bible, when they pick up their King James, they just assume that it's textually identical to the text that was created in 1611. And let me just read even from 2 editors. There have been 4 different individuals that have edited new texts of the King James Bible that were very, very prominent. And all 4 of them, well, there's been a bunch of editors through the years, but 4 of the editors that worked on new text of the King James Bible as a result also wrote important volumes about the King James and its history. 2 of those editors were Frederick Scrivener and David Norton. Frederick Scrivener was commissioned in the 1800s to produce a new edition of the King James Bible that would be a paragraph Bible. It was called the Cambridge Paragraph Bible. And as he sat down to do that work, he was a text critic, but also just an expert in the King James Bible and its history. It had been kind of a special focus from early on in his career. And he printed this new edition of the King James Bible in 1873 or 74, something like that. And he wrote this in the introduction to that Bible that was later printed as a separate book. He said, and I'm quoting him now, most readers will be aware that numberless and not inconsiderable departures from the original or standard edition of the authorized translation as published in 1611 are to be found in the modern Bibles. He means the modern King James, the modern Bibles which issue from the press by thousands every year. Some of these differences must be imputed to oversight and negligence, from which no work of man can be entirely free. In other words, some of them are just basic copy errors that happen in a pre-digital age. But then he says this, but much the greater part of them are deliberate changes introduced silently and without authority by men whose very names are often unknown. So here's an editor that sit down to look very, very closely at the editions of the King James Bible that have been made over the years. And there are hundreds of those editions, by the way. King James Bible has gone through many, many different editions. And he sat down with lots of them and he said, man, there are thousands of changes between these editions. Some of them clearly just errors of the press, but some of them are intentional changes. Many of them, he says, most of them are intentional changes made by editors. Well, David Norton was asked in the early 2000s to create a new text for Cambridge. He actually originally was just asked to decide which text of Cambridge was the most accurate. And when they got to looking at it, they realized we're kind of in the same boat as Scrivener. There's been lots of different editions. They've all changed in minor ways. So they changed their mind. And Cambridge said, actually, Dr. Norton, you've studied a lot of the King James and its history. You're one of the world's leading experts on it. Help us produce a new edition. So he sort of redid what Scrivener did, the new Cambridge Paragraph Bible. I think it was released in 2005, if I'm thinking right. Beautiful, beautiful Bible. We could talk about it at length and some of what it did to make its text great. But I just want to read a quote from him because he probably has studied those different editions more than anybody alive today. He said this, though it's the most important book in the religious life and the culture of the English-speaking world, the King James Bible, or authorized version of 1611, has never been perfectly printed. What we now read as the King James Bible contains numerous deliberate and some accidental changes to the text, and these can be revised, he says, to make it more faithful to the King James translator's own decision, which is what he tries to do in the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible. But he's explaining, yes, the text has been changed in every single edition. Editors are making specific differences and changes, choices. Now, I would say we want to be careful of 2 dangers when we talk about this. On the one hand, we don't want to make these changes seem more significant than they are. They are extremely minor, and you've linked to the article there. If people click on the article, I intentionally linked to 3 different appendixes, 2 of them in Scrivener and 1 of them in Norton, where people can just look at the changes for themselves. Because sometimes when people hear thousands of changes, they think, oh, so it's just a totally different Bible. Well, no. Yeah, not true. Still, the King James Version, you wouldn't notice the difference. If you read through one edition of the King James one year and the next year read through a different edition, you wouldn't even notice the difference. Unless you have them both side by side, comparing them one verse at a time, you're not going to notice these minor differences. So on the one hand, we don't want to over exaggerate them. But on the other hand, we also don't want to deny that they exist or downplay them. I meet people constantly. And in fact, my whole life growing up, I grew up in a King James only city. And people were adamant. I used to be adamant. I remember arguing with people. No, the King James Bible has never changed. Not one word of it has changed. It's exactly the same. The only thing that's ever changed is spelling and font. The words are exactly, every word exactly the same as 1611. And that's just not true. As anyone can see that looks through these appendixes, that's just not true. There are minor changes that have been made to the text. They're extremely minor.
It's not a matter of just simply being a printer error. Like it's not like some letters were missing in the press or whatever. So these are actual changes introduced into the King James Bible by Scrivener's own words, by anonymous sources.
And you raise a good question there, because sometimes people will dismiss these and say, okay, it's a printer's error. well, who decides what was a printer's error? That's actually part of the problem that later editors came to. They would see something in their copy of the King James Bible that looked like it was wrong. It didn't match the Hebrew text, didn't match the Greek text. So they'd say, oh, that must have been a printer's error. But whether to call something a printer's error is sometimes a very subjective judgment call. And so editors would make decisions sometimes to say this is a printer's error. And Norton would come back later and does this hundreds of times to say, actually, if we look at the data, it's really clear that for whatever reason, that was an intentional choice on the part of the King James translator. It wasn't a printer's error. But a lot of the changes where an editor thought they were fixing a printer's error introduced a new change into the King James Bible that probably wasn't a printer's error. So that's kind of a subjective way to term it. But yeah, the best thing I would recommend to anybody so that they don't get a wrong view or estimation of those changes is just dig through those appendixes yourself. I've got links to all three of them. You can pull them up for free and just look through some of the changes and you'll see what type they are, what nature they are, and how many of them there are, and then you'll get a good sense for the fact that this has changed.
I'll go ahead and put those links in the description below as well, so you can just open the description, you can click on them and go there and check it out for yourself. It's not anywhere near as bad as many have suggested, and it's also not anywhere near as good as anyone has suggested.
True. Yep.
Somewhere in the middle.
I would stay away from both extremes. Don't deny that there are changes or say the only changes are printing errors, but also don't make it sound like it's a whole new version. A lot of times people will compare it to like the New King James and say, in fact, when the New King James was marketed, they did that. They said, hey, the King James Bible's been revised many times. This is just one more revision. Well, that's really not true. The New King James Version was essentially a new translation of the Textus Receptus text, not just a light revision of the King James Bible. It's a totally different Bible. These changes are not of that scope, not of that magnitude.
Nowhere near it.
Yeah, nowhere near it.